Good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to today's webinar, The State of Low Carbon Hydrogen in Southeast Asia, Local Challenges and Global Trends, organized by the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I'm Jia Hui, your MC for today. Before we begin, I would like to go over a few housekeeping matters. Firstly, if you encounter any technical issues, please use the chat function to reach out to our technical support team. Secondly, to ask questions to the speakers, please use the Q&A function, stating your name and affiliation together with your question. You can send in your questions at any time. Lastly, if you would like to stay informed on our climate change program's activities, do sign up for updates at the URL which I will be sharing in the chat box shortly. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator for the session. Dr. Christopher Len is Visiting Senior Fellow at the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program here at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I will now invite him to begin the webinar. Dr. Len, please.
Morning, good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christopher Len. I am currently a Senior Visiting Fellow under the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I will be the moderator for this session. Today's seminar is about the state of low-carbon hydrogen development in Southeast Asia. We are going to look at what is happening in Southeast Asia and also learn about how global hydrogen trends will affect developments in our region. We will also see if there are lessons we can learn from what is happening in other parts of the world. I'm delighted to have two highly distinguished experts who will be speaking. The first speaker is Mr. Karthik Hari, who is a director and chief carbonization researcher at the Industry Research Department, Asia Office of Mizuho Bank of Singapore. The second speaker is Ms. Anne-Sophie Corbière. She is a global research scholar with the Center on Global Energy Policy, which is at Columbia University in the United States. Each speaker will be given 20 to 25 minutes for their presentations, and that will take us up to about 4 p.m. After that, we will have our Q&A session. Before I turn the mic over to the speakers, I want to give a quick pitch to a climate survey report our institute released a week ago. This will take less than 5 minutes. Jia Hui, can you share the screen, please? Yes. Okay, yeah. Yes, thank you. So this is a survey prepared by the Climate Change in Southeast Asia program. My colleagues have been doing this since 2020. Can I have the next page, please? So this year is the 4th year. For this survey, we had over 2,900 respondents answering 39 questions. The report is divided into 4 sections, as you will see. What I want to do is to quickly highlight some findings from this survey, which I thought is relevant to today's seminar. So it'll be very quick. I only have 3 slides to share. Next slide, please. So one of the questions we asked under section 3, which covers climate transition issues, is the question with regards to clean energy potential. So the question is, in your view, which sources of clean energy have the greatest potential in your country? So respondents are asked to select 2 choices. As usual, with the previous years, you see that solar energy, hydropower, and green energy are the ones with the highest respondents. But what's interesting this year is that we note that green hydrogen has started moving up the scale. It's currently on 5th place, up from 6th place. It displays biofuels, which was in 5th place last year. And we note that for the solar energy, which is the top-ranked clean energy of choice, there is quite a distinctive drop in terms of the number of respondents choosing solar energy. So it dropped from 80.1% to 69%. And a lot of these respondents have actually switched to green hydrogen and nuclear energy. But what's interesting here for the purpose of this seminar is I just wanted to flag that we see a 66% year-on-year increase. It's still not a lot, but we can see that there is greater awareness on green hydrogen among the Southeast Asian respondents. And this is something to watch out for. And of course, this is just a matter of perspective. They choose on a matter of perspective, and we can talk about how much they actually understand what's going on as well. Okay, next slide, please. So next slide shows the breakdown of nationality of the people that chose green hydrogen. You can see that in the cases of the blue boxes with Malaysia, Indonesia, and Vietnam, these are the ones where we saw significant increases. Near doubling of support for Malaysia and Indonesia, while we see that in Vietnam, the number of respondents choosing green hydrogen more than doubled from 6.5 to 15.3%. So one of the key reasons why there is such a finding is because these countries quite recently released their national hydrogen strategy reports. So there's greater awareness on development of green hydrogen in their countries. Next slide, please. So the next slide is a slightly different topic. Section 4 of the survey, we looked at climate leadership and cooperation. We asked the question, who is leading in global climate innovation? Interesting enough, Japan is number 1, America is 2nd place, and the EU is 3rd place in this year's survey findings. This comes a bit as a surprise for us because Japan, in terms of the technological developments, while there are various developments happening there, personally, I was a bit surprised that it came out tops. And it was also number 1 in last year's survey. And what we see is that the US has surpassed China and the EU to be 2nd place this year. And in terms of country breakdown, we see that Japan is highly favored in Brunei, in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Myanmar, in Thailand, whereas the US is the top choice in Laos and Cambodia. Vietnam and Singapore respondents rank the EU highest. I pulled out this one because we are talking about green hydrogen, and of course, there is the question of development of green hydrogen technologies. So I thought it would be interesting to flag this. Next slide, please. So that's the end of my quick pitch. If you are interested in the report, you can scan the QR code. You can also join our newsletter. There's the QR code there below as well. And back to the seminar. Jiahui, thank you very much. Okay, so now is the time for our panelists to make their presentations. The first speaker will be Mr. Karthik Ari. Karthik, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Len. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the other panelists. This is Karthik. I'm from Mizuho Bank, Singapore. I would like the MC to kindly share the screen and take me to page 3. Without much ado, let me introduce myself and my bank quickly. Not many might have heard of my bank. It's called Mizuho Bank. Japan has only 3 big banks, the red, the green, and the blue. And page number 3. Yeah, this is, yes. So the red is, you must have all heard of Mitsubishi, and then the green, Sumitomo, and blue is Mizuho. And one of the unique functions about this bank is that we have a predecessor bank called the Industrial Bank of Japan. And we have an in-house industry research and advisory department so that we understand the topics on which we are advising our clients closely. And I come from the industry research department, Asia office, as can be seen in the next slide. Next slide, please. Yeah, yes. So I belong to the Singapore office, as can be seen in this red box as highlighted. And I cover 5 topics. I cover renewables, I cover hydrogen, ammonia, I cover biofuels, e-fuels, I cover carbon credits, and also these are the 5-finger approach I do, right? Carbon capture. So that will be the 5th finger. So I cover the 5 fingers. And that is my area of coverage, and area of coverage will be from India to Australia. And of late, we have been focusing a lot on hydrogen because number one, we have financed hydrogen, and we are also interested in ensuring that it gets used well. And what I'll do now is that for the next 15 minutes, I'll briefly walk you through the industry trends in India and ASEAN, and give a highlight of a few critical countries. So before I set off, let me first tell you what are the colors of hydrogen, because everybody must be reading the newspaper, but there are many colors of hydrogen. So if you go to page 6, next slide, please. Yeah. So hydrogen by color, depending on the emission. So currently what happens is that a lot of hydrogen is either produced from natural gas or from coal. So brown hydrogen is produced through the gasification of fossil fuel, usually coal. And then there is black hydrogen, and then there is purple hydrogen or red hydrogen, which is from nuclear power, and then it starts getting cleaner. The more you go down the table, the cleaner your hydrogen is. And then whatever you produce using grid power is yellow hydrogen. And then off late, you must be hearing this term in ASEAN a lot, turquoise hydrogen and green hydrogen. Turquoise hydrogen is nothing. You basically split natural gas, and then you produce solid carbon, avoiding emissions in the process, and produce clean hydrogen. Now, where is hydrogen first used? Before we get into policy and the other problems, etc., let us first see basically why it is so important. Where is it used? We see the next page. I'm just using India as an example because amongst the ASEAN and India region, India has the most advanced hydrogen production program today. And fertilizer and refinery, basically they dominate the usage. Dominate the usage of hydrogen. If you see on the left-hand side graph on this page, right? Basically, you can see fertilizer and refinery put together is 90% of usage. On the right-hand side, if you see, hydrogen is such a small molecule. It escapes very easily. So people basically prefer to produce it on-premise, local make, local use. So that's the mantra usually in most regions of the world. You make it locally and use it locally. And if you see on the right-hand side, most of it is captively used. So oil companies, gas companies, petrochemical companies, they break natural gas on the spot, and then they use it on the spot itself and emit the carbon. So basically it is all gray hydrogen too. And the supply chain is shown below. So what happens is that they say a petrochemical company is there in Jurong. They will buy natural gas from Tuas, bring it to Jurong, and then they will break it down using steam methanation, SMR it's called, and then they will gasification, and then they will split and produce the gray hydrogen, store it in a tank on the premise, and when it is required in the refinery, say Shell wants it or whatever, they'll just use it there and then and there. And that is the most common use supply chain today, as you can see in page 7. So now we have set the ground. Why? So you can see it's highly polluting. You're emitting a lot of carbon when you are producing gray hydrogen, as you can imagine. So this is the background of definition of color of hydrogen and where it is used currently and how the supply chain is structured. So now, if you are going to make this clean, because everybody after the Paris Agreement wants to decarbonize. How do you decarbonize? If you go to, what are the policies? If you see the next page, this is where the ASEAN 6 region and India are standing. If you see there, it's hydrogen. You can see you can see there are three big roads. There is a decarbonization declaration. So basically every prime minister, president going to Paris or Davos, announcing decarbonization plans. I will do net zero by 2050 like Singapore. I will do net zero by 2060 like Indonesia. I will do net zero only by 2070 like India. So there are two parts to it. There is the price part and there is the quantity part. The price part is done through carbon pricing and the quantity part is done through the policies in each subsector. And so there are basically four major policy thrusts: fostering renewables, hydrogen ammonia, biofuels, and CCUS. Why do we have different tools? It is precisely the same thing as why we have a fork, a spoon, and a knife. Because you cannot eat soup with a fork. You cannot cut meat with a spoon, right? So similarly, renewable energy can be used only in some places. You cannot take solar panel and put it and expect an industrial boiler to not use steam. That is not possible. Again, when you are making petrochemicals, you need hydrogen. When you have steel, when you make steel, you need hydrogen. You cannot replace it with anything else. And biofuels, e-fuels. So suppose you want to still use your own car, CNG bus or CNG car, but replace it with biogas. Then you need that new fuel. And then what about industries which are not amenable to any of these options? Then you have carbon capture. So what happens is that each tool has a different role to play. And hydrogen happens to be very important. And if you see here, there will be a circle and there will be a triangle. What it means is a circle means it shows seriousness. There is legislation, there is also declaration in the LTLEDS, which the countries put out along with their NDC. And the triangle means there is only a limited declaration or partial legislation. And if it is a dash, basically means the country is not doing anything. We see on the pricing part is where a lot of countries have not done much. Because carbon tax is on the downstream, you are putting it on end users. So the politically the most sensitive thing to do, say in Indonesia or Malaysia, where a lot of subsidies are provided. Then you have emissions trading mostly in the upstream and midstream. And then you come to the production of energy, renewables, hydrogen, etc. And that is where we are standing. So Singapore and India, to an extent, Malaysia and Indonesia are following, behind these two countries. This is the state of affairs. And hydrogen is in a very preliminary state in most countries. In ASEAN, only Malaysia and Indonesia, to a certain extent Thailand, can boast that they are trying to do something about introduction of low carbon hydrogen. In this case, most of the time it is green hydrogen. If you go to the next page, what happens is that I will briefly walk you through how much contribution, what is each country trying to do. India, as I mentioned, is doing the most for green hydrogen in this region, both on the supply front and on the demand front. So if you see here, green ammonia, if you see the red box, India is attempting to produce, attempting to create a demand, in fact, of 27 million tons by 2050. So for every million tons, 10 million tons of emissions is avoided. So 27 million tons of domestic use of green hydrogen by 2050 will mean around 300 million tons of emissions are avoided or reduced because of this policy. There are also other tools. So if you see the next page, you can see why hydrogen is not a magic bullet. That is why it is one of the tools. So if you see on the right hand side, you can see different tools, how they are contributing. The left hand side more part is, what if I don't do anything? If emissions grow at this rate. So India was at 3.1 gigatons a year just before COVID. It is expected to be at 4 gigatons by 2030. And it will be at 6+ gigatons by 2050 if things go as usual. I do nothing about it. But what if I introduce renewables? I can almost reduce 800 million tons. What if I introduce hydrogen at the level I am promising to do, like 27 million tons a year of usage by 2050? I can reduce 300 million tons. What if I increase forest cover, another 300 million tons? But then that still leaves me a big gap because I am telling the world by 2050 I will be at 2.6 gigatons. What does this tell me? I also need carbon capture. And if I want to be on net zero path by 2050, I further need to be at half of what I have announced till today. 2.6, half of it is 1.3, which means I need additional hydrogen, I need additional renewables, and I need additional carbon. So that is why it's very, very important, because hydrogen in itself could nearly contribute to at least 8%, close to 10% in GHG emission reductions in the case of India. Now, if you come close to ASEAN and look at the biggest country in ASEAN, Indonesia, in terms of population. What about Indonesia? Indonesia is at a more early stage compared to India. And if you see the role of green hydrogen, green ammonia, their needs are more modest. Their goals are more modest. India is aiming at 27 million tons of usage. They are only aiming at probably 1.5 to 2 million tons of usage by 2050, which means that the amount of reduction will also be accordingly reduced, and they will be probably able to reduce the use hydrogen only for around 20 to 30 million tons of reduction of emissions. So the impact of hydrogen would be more limited, but it will still be there. This is the next page, a very similar graph to India. If you see here, in the case of Indonesia, what is happening is that because they are deforesting a lot, renewables and reduction of deforestation will have a more impact compared to hydrogen or biofuels or e-fuels, etc., whatever they are telling. By the way, if you want to get e-fuels correct, you have to get hydrogen correct, because to make e-fuels, at least carbon-based e-fuels, carbon and hydrogen are input, which means if you don't reduce input cost, your output cost is going to be high. So first is the country, India, where hydrogen can contribute significantly. Second is the case of Indonesia, where significant contribution is unlikely in the next 30 years. And then we come to an uncertain case, a so-called loaded dice. Malaysia could go either. way. What about Malaysia? If you go to the next page, Malaysia has announced a very ambitious policy in the region. So if you see here, one hydrogen hub, the 3 hydrogen hubs, they are also looking at carbon capture hub. Here, if you see the red box on the right-hand corner, 2.5 million tons of production by 2050, which is very significant considering the limited geographical spread of Malaysia. But what would be needed is that the size of the Malaysian grid will need to more than double. That is the simple challenge we are facing. It needs to more than double. And that is the problem which ASEAN has. And for it to double means a lot of money. And what is the problem with that? You need to produce new fuels cheap enough so that they can be adapted. Either you put a carbon tax on fossil, or you make the green fuels cheap, or more likely both. And so if you summarize the issue, if you go to the next page, what are the problems facing development of green hydrogen in ASEAN? Just 3. First is the biggest one. A is reduction of production and landed cost. Landed cost is at what it is not enough to produce it cheap. But the price you pay is what it costs you to actually land the hydrogen on your premise, at your home or your factory. So that's the first thing. Second, it is related to this. That is why I have drawn a circle, because it's a vicious circle, so to speak, today. Developing commercial end use. The third, to enable A and B, resolving technical problems. If you go today to, say, Laos, Cambodia, or even Vietnam, there are no safety or export standards. Even in Thailand, there are lacunae. Even in India, it's work in progress. So these 3 things need to be handled very well for hydrogen to actually penetrate and to be used properly. Now, if you see the case of India, why I use India again and again is that India will probably act as a template for the rest of ASEAN, because if India fails, Indonesia is not likely to succeed. Indonesia is unlikely to succeed. Malaysia is unlikely to succeed. Malaysia is unlikely to succeed. Thailand is unlikely to succeed. So it's basically a daisy chain. One falls, domino effect, all the other nations will fall. So if we go to if you see this page on the Indian National Green Hydrogen Mission, so what is India doing? Compared to carbon capture in India, this program is way more structured. if you look at the pilot end usage, there is on the demand, there is a 7% budget allotted, which is quite significant. 7% of 2.5 billion is not an insignificant amount. And then what they are doing, they are focusing 90% of their energy on production of electrolyzers and hydrogen. Why? If you don't solve the supply side problem first and then start solving the demand side problem, you are likely to be left with doing nothing. Even with all this, in India, if you see the second message line, the GHCO, the Green Hydrogen Consumption Obligation, is still delayed because even at 1%, 5% or 10% blending, it is proving very difficult to reduce costs, even though costs are coming down faster in India than anywhere else in the region where there is no subsidy. So India doesn't offer subsidy. Now, on the supply side, if you see on the right-hand side, what are they trying to do? They are first trying to lay the ground for making electrolyzers in India and reducing the cost of producing green hydrogen on the supply side. And then they want to boost the production by 2030 to 5 million tons a year, so that the industry gets scale merit and the costs further go down in a bootstrapped fashion. On the demand side, what they are doing, they are choosing sectors which are hard to abate. That is, it is better to choose sectors which are very, very difficult to abate. No, there is no point using hydrogen there is no point using hydrogen to fuel your car, because electricity can do the work much better, or CNG can do the work much better in the interim. It's like saying I want to wash my hands in the wash basin with champagne. You can do it, but should you do it is a question. So that is why India is saying I will use hydrogen in hard to abate sectors first, where hydrogen is actually required, which will be like steel, refinery, petrochemicals, fertilizer, etc. And then they will shift demand downstream to other sectors. And what is the problem they are facing? If you go to the next page, this is the problem we are facing. If you see on the left, from the left-hand side to right-hand side, you should see this graph. The gray hydrogen. Today, without any carbon price, in India, gray hydrogen is little less than $2. If you add transportation cost and delivery cost, not more than $2.50. Okay? And if you see the production cost of green hydrogen in India, if you see that it ranges very high currently. It goes all the way up to $5.7. This is just at the factory gate before you are liquefying the hydrogen or making it into a carrier, into ammonia, etc., and transporting it. So if you have to multiply this roughly by 9 to get the MMBTU price, so that you can compare it with LNG. Basically, Japan imported LNG at $12 in the past 10 years. This is the average price, which is $1.3 a kilo is LNG price at which it was imported. Look at the cost of hydrogen, $5.7. More than 4 times, close to 5 times. So that is therein lies the crux of the problem. And if you see the red line on top, you are at say $2.50 to $3. By the time you are landing it in Japan or in ASEAN from India or even Australia, today, if you use a small ship or ISO tank, as they are called, for small scale transport of hydrogen by ship, you are looking at huge hike in landed cost to $7 to $8. In some cases, I even heard it is north of $10, which is not strange because Japan imported hydrogen for $90 in MMBTU just a couple of years. So this is the single biggest problem ASEAN 6 region will also likely face. And if I can summarize quickly, so these are the problems which we have to solve in a pan-ASEAN view, perspective. If you see the next page, I can summarize the issues as follows on the demand side and on the supply side. What needs to be done on the demand side? The problem is that there is a delayed consumption mandate today that needs to be guaranteed. Then there needs to be enabling demand usage infrastructure. Say, suppose you are blending hydrogen into the city gas. You need to come up with cascades, or you need to come up with infrastructure which can actually introduce hydrogen into your network safely. Last but not the least, market is price cross quantity. If without a price on carbon, This will not fly because the problem is that unless you incentivize the current methodology or way we are working, there will be no incentive to adopt new technology. On the supply side, you need to have other infrastructure which complements production. What is the problem? In India, you are mostly using tube trailers. Pipelines are prohibitively expensive. You need to put production at a place where it is more useful to put a pipeline and then transport, and regulatory framework on export rules and financing costs. Even a 2% reduction in financing costs can actually knock off your LCOH or levelized cost of hydrogen by almost $1, depending on the country. And assuming that we want to export, if you see the next page, we are not India, Malaysia are not the only countries which are trying to export hydrogen. You should remember that there are countries in the Middle East, there is the US, there is Australia, who are all trying to export and who offer better subsidies. So for nations which are not only considering domestic demand but also wanting to export, scale merit by reducing costs, which is point A, which we raised, will be very, very important. So overall assessment from my side is that while hydrogen will pick up, next page, hydrogen will pick up in terms of usage around after 2040, closer to 2050. We will see pickup of usage of hydrogen. But is it like a miracle cure or is it a solve it all type of solution? No, it is not. It will get used mostly in the sectors which I have shown in page 19 on the right hand side. If you see here, refineries are the likely ones which are likely to use the first because they are cost insensitive. There's no way they can escape. Next would be, you look at heavy transport, then fertilizer, refinery, petrochemical, steel, blending in city gas, etc. Blending in city gas will come towards the end because wherever price transfer to the end user is close to being very direct, that will be the amount that will be more difficult to do. And if we have to solve all that, we are currently focusing on manufacturing electrolyzers and making hydrogen production cost cheap. But if you see on the left-hand side, the points of future focus will be that further knocking down renewable energy costs, liquefaction and transport infrastructure and storage infrastructure at scale, because today it is frightfully expensive because it nearly doubles the landed price of hydrogen, say in Japan or in Vietnam or in Philippines, as things stand today. So unless there is and this should be matched downstream by a large scale offtake. So if these are not matched, and if there is a mismatch, we will continue to see a lot of projects just not proceeding beyond the seed stage like they are today. And that is something we should seek to avoid because hydrogen can very easily contribute to at least 1/10, if not more than 1/6 to each country's emission reduction efforts. Thank you. I'll be happy to take questions after Dr. Corbu finishes. I hand over the stage to Dr. Glenn.
Thank you very much, Karthik. I think your presentation is broad in scope and you've provided pretty in-depth analysis. You talked about cost issues, technical challenges, and the question of who the off-takers and end users are. And what I conclude based on what I've heard from you is that actually there's still a lot of uncertainty in the hydrogen markets in Southeast Asia, as well as in India. We are still in the early days, unlike in the West where they focus more on subsidies. We don't have that privilege here in this region. So it's going to be expensive. And I will stop here. And now I would like to invite the second speaker, Anne-Sophie, to speak. Anne-Sophie, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Len, and thank you for the kind invitation to present today. I am going to present more on a relatively global scope, but you will see that many of my points actually are quite similar to what Mr. Karthik has already mentioned. If we can move to the next slide, please. So in fact, I started working on hydrogen 25 years ago, which which is quite early. And then I realized, well, I am way too early for hydrogen because it was picking up very, very slowly at that time. So I spent quite a lot of my time working on natural gas while keeping an eye on hydrogen. And then finally, after the Paris Agreement in 2015, we started hearing about hydrogen again. There was a report from the Hydrogen Council in 2017, and then the IEA did their special report on the future of hydrogen in 2019. And you can say that by 2020, 2021, there was a lot of hype on hydrogen. We could see already a lot of strategies being written. The first one actually was written by Japan in 2017, but many strategies, national strategies started to appear 2020, 2021, and now there are more than 60 countries which have national hydrogen strategies or roadmap. The problem is that there has been a lot of hype during those years. And if you were listening to the most optimistic people, they were putting hydrogen pretty much everywhere, in cars, in homes. And for me, it's actually a pretty bad message because hydrogen is actually quite complicated and should be used where it actually makes sense, which is why I kind of agree with Kartik on, it's only one of the solutions to decarbonization. So now I think time has come for reality check. First of all, as we have already seen, the targets, the cost targets, which were announced in 2020 or 2021, the $1 per kilogram is not going to be achieved by 2030. This was a number which was announced in many strategies. If I'm taking Chile, for example, or even the United States, forget about it, it's not going to happen. And one of the reasons, besides the fact that it was very optimistic, is the fact that we are facing higher financing costs, higher electrolyzer costs because of the increase in terms of raw material, and also higher costs of renewable energy, renewable electricity, which is very important. Also, people have realized that hydrogen is simply very complicated. First of all, you need to have everything aligned. So you are lucky if you are producing the hydrogen next to the final user, but this is not always the case. So sometimes you need to build the infrastructure. People are starting to think about storage, which is very important when you are producing only renewable hydrogen. And also, we see that there are a lot of projects, supply projects, but where is the demand? Because hydrogen is more expensive than, or clean hydrogen is more expensive than the fossil fuel-based hydrogen alternative or the energies that people are using, they are not very likely to want to switch to this new vector unless there is a subsidy, a support, contract for difference, quota. So either some carrots or some sticks in order to force the demand side to move towards hydrogen. And this is exactly what people have come to realize pretty much everywhere in the world about hydrogen. The demand is not really there. As I mentioned, it's not the Swiss Army knife of the energy industry. You are not going to put hydrogen everywhere. You're not going to put hydrogen in cars unless it really, really makes sense in some very special case. You're not going to put hydrogen in homes for heating. So it has to be used where it makes sense. Also, I have been looking at, how we are going to trade hydrogen. And the point is that hydrogen is extremely complicated to transport internationally. So there have been a lot of different methods which have been looked at. There has been liquid hydrogen, and Japan tried to do that 2 years ago. But it was a moderately happy experience. There have been a certain number of cargoes of low carbon hydrogen which have been already produced and sent, exported. Ammonia is, of course, one of the easiest because it's already well known. There is infrastructure. People are familiar with that kind of vector. Also, finally, one of the reasons why things are taking a lot of time is that the regulatory framework is actually taking a lot of time to be developed. People, before they invest, they want to make sure that the regulatory framework is not going to change. If we can move to the next slide. So this is coming from a very recent report which was published exactly 1 week ago by the Hydrogen Council. And it's showing something that we have mentioned before, the fact that, well, there is rising interest in hydrogen is also maybe because globally we can see a small increase in terms of the committed project, which is probably the most important. So if you have to remember two things on this graphic, the first one is that there is a big gap between what is committed, so the project which has been FID'd, and what has been announced. And this is exactly the problem for hydrogen. There are a lot of announcements, a lot of projects, but before people take the final investment decision, a lot of things need to be in place, which is why you have a big ratio between what is actually moving forward and what has been announced. The second thing, however, is that since 2023, there has been quite a lot of progress because mostly in two countries, the United States and China, there has been quite a lot of progress or quite a lot of support. And you can see that about 60% of the committed investment is actually coming from these two countries, followed then by Europe, Japan, Korea, the Middle East. But really, these two countries, China and the US, are making a lot of investments in terms of hydrogen. If we can now move to the next slide in terms of the volumes. So you can see what this means in terms of, well, the projects. You can see that, we have a relatively high density of projects in North America, in Europe, in China as well. India is also pretty good. Couple of projects there and there in Southeast Asia, also in Australia. Africa, which has a lot of ambition in terms of hydrogen, and also Latin America, well, they are a little bit lagging behind. You can see, however, that in terms of the volumes which have really been committed, you have two big regions. You have North America, so the United States and Canada, and I have to say probably more the United States and China. I was in Houston last week. People were really looking at hydrogen in a more positive way. Also because a lot of people are investing in what I call low carbon hydrogen. So this is a hydrogen which is based on natural gas and CCUS, because the regulatory frameworks, the Inflation Reduction Act, and especially the 45Q, which is giving you a price for the CO2 that you are going to capture and to store. That is relatively bipartisan, so people feel quite confident that they can go forward with their projects, because whatever is going to happen with the next presidential election, at least that part should be relatively secure. You can also see that a lot of projects are moving forward in China. China, I have to say, is kind of an interesting country because if you're looking at the state target, they are saying that by 2025, there should be only between 100 to 200 kilotons of hydrogen, of renewable hydrogen, which is very, very small for a country which is actually already using more than 33 million tons of hydrogen. However, last year, we did an in-depth analysis of what the provinces are doing and what they are saying in terms of the targets. And then you have a totally different picture, because the provinces, if you are putting all of them together, they are targeting 1.1 million tons by 2025, which is basically almost a factor 10 compared to the country's target. But you can say, okay, maybe the provinces are very ambitious, especially Inner Mongolia, which has a lot of potential in terms of solar and wind. But that doesn't mean that this is going to be realized. Well, actually, when you look at the project under construction, it's quite likely that China is going to have a decent number in terms of green hydrogen production, probably 500,000 tons. If we can move to the next slide. So what does that mean in terms of the potential volumes which could be globally available? And again, we are talking about low carbon or low emissions hydrogen, which can be either the renewable. So this is what Kartik called green, but I actually don't like the colors, and low carbon, which is what is called blue. the Hydrogen Council thinks that based on all the different projects that are different stages of announcements, whether they have been, whether they are already operational, and very few of them, less than 1 million ton now, what is under construction, what is FID, what is in FEED, feasibility study, etc. So they are making some assumptions that you can see on the right of the graphic. There could be between 12 and 18 million tons of hydrogen operating by 2030. This compares to total hydrogen demand, which is 95 million tons as of 2022. It also relatively in line with what BNEF was saying earlier this year, 16 million tons. But you can see that when you are comparing with some scenarios, especially the IEA net zero scenario, we are way below. So it's more aligned with, announced pledges scenarios. So there is progress, but it's not as ambitious as what people were saying before. And it's not really, in line with net zero scenario where people and organizations like the IEA or BP tend to have a lot of hydrogen. I should say that the numbers here for BP, which are coming from their latest energy outlook, are unfortunately showing 2035, which is kind of misleading because what you expect is to have a relatively strong growth between 2030 and 2035 because projects are accelerating and we need to have lower costs, we need to have more demand visibility and all these things, and also the regulatory framework to be in place so that investors can move forward. Next slide, please. We talked a little bit about demand, and again, it's absolutely essential not to say, oh yes, I can put hydrogen everywhere. No, there are sectors where hydrogen makes absolute sense. And these sectors are actually the sectors where hydrogen is already used, except that this is fossil-based hydrogen. So the refining, the methanol, the petrochemical, the refining, ammonia, petrochemical like methanol. Also, everything which is long-haul transport, either on the maritime side or aviation side. Primary steel, that would be one of the ways to decarbonize the steel. More uncertain is some aviation. Seasonal electricity storage is something which is discussed a lot. Seasonal because, for example, if you have a lot of wind and solar during summer, but you are in the northern atmosphere and you are going to electrify your economy and people are going to be using electricity during winter for heating, you are going to have this mismatch between a very high demand during winter and all the electricity coming notably from solar during summer. So you need something to store on a seasonal basis. And one of the potential vectors could be hydrogen. It's terribly inefficient because you are producing electricity, using electricity to produce hydrogen, storing the hydrogen, and then using the hydrogen again to produce electricity. So on an efficiency point of view, it's terrible. But unless somebody is coming up with a better idea, or you are in a country where they have, for example, pumped hydro, there are not that many options unless somebody is thinking about something else. In this analysis, which is done by the Energy Innovation Center, they find that, heavy-duty vehicle, for example, some industrial processes are probably not so great. And as we mentioned already, cars, heating in building, definitely not a good idea. And for day-to-day power generation, the batteries are definitely going to be better. So the summary is that when you are looking at hydrogen, you need to put it where it makes sense, not because it's very nice, it's colorful, and somebody's telling you that we are going to have a hydrogen economy with pipelines running everywhere. It is a complicated molecule. On $1 per MMBTU, it's super expensive. $1 per kilogram is about $9 per MMBTU. So you need to use it absolutely where it makes sense. Next slide, please. Regulation is making progress. Why does it make sense for people in Southeast Asia? Well, because in those two regions, they are actually really far ahead in terms of regulation. I would concede that in Europe, we are probably way too obsessed with regulation. We tend to want to regulate absolutely everything. Let me start with the United States. 2 years ago, there was a big schism in terms of the hydrogen because the Inflation Reduction Act was announced in August 2022. What I find really beautiful about the IRA, it's technology neutral. So the only thing which matters is not the color of hydrogen, it's the carbon intensity. So the lower the carbon intensity, for example, if it's lower than 0.5 kilogram of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen, then you can receive up to $3 per kilogram, especially if you are actually promoting local investment and local employment, which is, relatively generous in terms of production tax credit. If you are looking at, the announced cost, if you are looking at what we were saying before about the current cost of hydrogen, $3 per kilogram is pretty good. But unfortunately, we're still waiting for the final guidance, which I think has been delayed because of the presidential election. So among all the paragraphs in the IRA, there are really two which are of special interest for the hydrogen industry. The first one I already mentioned, this is 45Q. This is when you are producing low carbon hydrogen, you are producing that based on natural gas and you are storing the CO2. The second one is 45V, which is more on renewable hydrogen because this is the one which is giving you, the highest carbon, the highest production tax credit based on this lower emission. But the problem is that there has been a lot of discussion on what we need to say about renewable electricity, which is going to be used to power those projects in terms of renewable electricity. And people don't want the existing renewable electricity to be cannibalized and used for new hydrogen projects, because otherwise that will lead to higher emissions in the United States. This is exactly the same thing which had been discussed in the European Union for 3 years during 2020 and 2023. So all these issues about additionality, you need to add additional renewable capacity, temporal matching, you need to make sure that on an hourly basis, the electricity you are using is actually coming from renewable source, and also geographical matching, so you are using something nearby, which was one of the bases of the delegated acts which were published in 2023. Which have been providing more clarity on renewable fuel and non-biological origin. And again, why does it matter? Well, this matters because the European Union is going to be one of the few importers of hydrogen and derivatives. So if you want to export to that market, you have to understand what they really want in terms of hydrogen, in terms of ammonia and the specificities. Also, we spent a lot of time in Europe to design the hydrogen and decarbonized gas package, which is really about infrastructure. So how are you going to design the infrastructure related to hydrogen? And also, how are the hydrogen system going to interact with the natural gas system and also with the electricity system? So we have different bodies which need to cooperate on that. Now, as I mentioned, Europe has been really obsessed with renewable hydrogen, but they are now looking at a delegated act on low carbon hydrogen, which is under preparation. Hopefully, it's going to be finalized before the existing commission is going to exit. We should have a new commission, which is currently being discussed by the 1st of November, hopefully. Next slide. US is also interesting because of the hubs which were mentioned before. So you would say, well, the US is actually giving a lot of money on the production side. And it's true that in the US, it's really about carrots, it's really about helping the production side. However, it has become clear that that is not going to be enough. And this is again coming back to this issue about demand. So one of the ideas was to create hubs. And there has been a lot of competition for the money which could be available from the Department of Energy. So 7 hubs have been selected last year. They are going to be given a total of $7 billion. they are going to be, because while these 7 hubs were selected and announced, they still need to go through a certain number of milestones before they are getting all the money. So for the moment, only 3 have been awarded. The others are under award negotiation. So this is progressing, but maybe not all of them are going to make it to the finish line. Why hubs are important? Because this is, again, putting in the production side, the infrastructure, and the demand side in the same pocket, and try to have them working together. Because if you're only focusing on the supply side, this is never going to work. So this is the important thing. And on top of that, the Department of Energy has realized, well, this is still not enough. So they are adding an additional $1 billion, which is really for demand side support. Next slide, please. Work that we have done over the past year is to do a whole screening of at that time it was, I think, 54 hydrogen strategies. Now we have more than 60 hydrogen strategies. We have looked at, how you can produce hydrogen, or how the countries are planning to produce hydrogen, but also how they are planning to export or import, or maybe they don't know, the hydrogen and the derivatives. And what we found out is that a lot of countries want to export hydrogen, a lot of them. So I think we mentioned India, for example, Indonesia, Australia, the United States, a lot of Latin American countries, and even in Europe, if you are looking very closely, yes, there is this part in the center of Europe, but look, all the northern countries in Europe, Norway, Finland, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and then in the south, Portugal, Spain, they all want to export, and even the countries in the eastern side of Europe, and then you have the countries in northern Africa. So it's much more complicated. Bottom line, the markets which really want to import, Europe or parts of Europe, Japan, Korea, Singapore, they may not be such a huge market at the end of the day. And that means that there is going to be a very intense competition between all these countries which want to export. So in those countries, you need to have not only relatively low-cost hydrogen or derivatives, but you also need to be able to attract the investments and to have some bilateral agreements with those importing countries in order to make sure that your projects are going to take off. Final very important point on this graphic is China. China has not said anything about whether they want to import or export. And when you are looking at the current role of China, for example, in the oil market, in the gas market, in the coal market, that could make a huge difference for this new energy vector. Next slide, please. So, as my final slide, maybe going back to my very first slide, we have been going for a hype. I would say that 2020, 2021, we were on the peak on the left side of my graphic. 2023, we were maybe at the bottom of that graphic. Now, in my opinion, we are moving back up. There is more confidence. People have realized, okay, this is not that easy, but we need to proceed carefully. So I would say, first, be very pragmatic. I have seen many hydrogen strategies which have pie-in-the-sky targets. Many of these targets are never going to be realized, especially when you are looking at 2030. So it's all very good to be super ambitious, but when this is really too optimistic, it doesn't make any sense because people basically lose hope. So be pragmatic. Collaborate as well. It's very unlikely that only one company completely isolated is going to change everything and be able to move forward. And also in Southeast Asia, I would say, do a little bit like Europe. One of the beauties of Europe is that we have some sort of integrated system where, and especially in terms of the infrastructure, we are going to do things together. Southeast Asia is one of the few regions where, that could be replicated. Also think locally, think about your domestic market and then about exports, because as I mentioned, the trade market is maybe not going to be that big. Look at various options in terms of production. I know people are really obsessed with renewable hydrogen, especially based on solar and wind, there are other options. There are options with hydro, there are options with bioenergy. There could be also options if you have very low methane emission and you want to use natural gas and then CCS. So the only thing which really matters is carbon intensity. And finally, as I mentioned several times, look at the sectors which are really, really ready to accept slightly more expensive hydrogen and think about how you can help them. But definitely the existing sectors, the existing consumers of hydrogen, like ammonia, like the refining sector, like the petchem, these are the first target. That will conclude my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention.
Very much, Anne-Sophie. It was a very detailed presentation. It provided a very good overview of global projects by key potential producers. And the way I get to do is that first, we need to think carefully about the demand sectors. Second, demand and project progress is slower than expected. Next, we need to wait for clarity on the regulation side. Another point, it's a very competitive environment for export. And I think this is one of those questions I have for Southeast Asian governments as well. With regards to them, their interest in producing, whether it's actually to be used for domestic decarbonization purposes or whether they're just looking at hydrogen for the sake of generating international money, funds, yeah, revenue. Okay, so we now move on to the Q&A segment. And we can take questions from the audience. I'm sorry, I'm not sure why the sound quality for my system isn't that good, but I will try my best to speak slowly. So we have one question from Elena Reshitova. Kartik answered that in his message, but I think it's good to read it out so that both of you can answer on video. So there are two questions by her. Question to Kartik. When talking about potential demand for hydrogen, you mentioned only existing mature sectors. How about the role of emerging demand sectors, for example, the one that's making headlines now? Data centers and by association, energy-intensive AI development. Do you see new demand making any difference to the overall trajectory of hydrogen development in South and Southeast Asia? So this is a question for Kartik, but Anne-Sophie, if you like to, you can answer that too. I will let Kartik answer first before I follow on with the second question. Kartik, please.
So my answer will be more focused on the region where it is on hand. So as Sophie covered in her presentation, right, there are sectors where hydrogen can be used, and there are sectors where it will be like washing your hands in the wash basin with champagne. One should not be doing that. So data centers, AI, etc. From my perspective, at least for this region, it is better to focus on hard-to-abate sectors where hydrogen can actually make a difference. Because for data centers and other industrial uses. Well, for example, for data centers, I can give you an example. You can use for what we call in India, we are attempting RERPC, renewable round-the-clock power. So they're trying to balance it with PV, wind, and storage. So you can get 24 hours balanced power. And then they are also trying to use more energy efficient heat pumps, heat exchangers, etc., which can actually reduce their energy demand in these sectors. So my thought is similar to what Sophie said about Swiss Army knife approach. Hydrogen is not a Swiss Army knife. It's not a magic solution. So it is better to stick to these primary 5-6 sectors where hydrogen will have the maximal impact in terms of emission reduction. So that is what I think. And I might be trading on Sophie's toes here, but the question below to address to Sophie also caught my attention. My sense is that carrot and stick approach will not work in lower middle income or even middle income countries forget even upper middle income countries like Indonesia, it will not work because that is not how things are structured here. So an European approach will probably not be the best way to go about it here. And that is where I stand. Thank you.
Yeah, I am going to take a different approach regarding AI. My concern about AI and the growth that we are hearing about everywhere is that this may actually take away some of the growth of renewable electricity from hydrogen production, because we know that everywhere, first of all, you are using the renewable electricity in order to decarbonize your electricity demand, or electricity generation. But then if electricity demand is growing faster than we anticipated, then we need to run even faster. But on top of that, we know that we need renewable electricity for hydrogen production. So that means that the target is becoming more and more complicated to achieve. And this is a big concern. I have to say that everywhere I am going, I am kind of concerned about the impact on the power generation side. I was talking last week about the US, and people are saying, well, that likely means that we are going to use more natural gas in the power sector, which basically means more CO2 emissions at the end of the day, because they don't see how this is going to lead to or how more renewable could be developed for also the AI. But at the same time, the data centers, they also want to have access to green electricity because this is their kind of mandate. So that's complicated. The question, I think there was a question on the 45.2 target in Europe on the industry side. So we are in 2024, at the end of 2024. Let's be realistic. We have the kind of European Commission target. They have just published a document which is explaining a little bit better, how this is going to work out. These still need to be implemented at the country level. We are in 2024, and the industrials, they don't have enough clarity. So whether I think that half or 42% of our current hydrogen demand in Europe is going to move to something cleaner, well, actually renewable, I don't think so. I don't think this is realistic. Or you are going to deindustrialize Europe, which is a big concern because our demand has already decreased quite substantially. We have lost roughly 20% of our industrial gas demand in Europe, and I think people are really concerned about deindustrialization. And if you read the Draghi report, this is exactly about that. So Mr. Draghi is saying, well, okay, we need to move forward in terms of decarbonization, etc., but not at the expense of our industry. So you need to be kind of pragmatic. Yes, you want to decarbonize, but not at any cost. And the problem is that renewable hydrogen is super expensive and is still not making enough progress. So what I'm hearing, not publicly, but behind the scenes is, well, we may have to look at low carbon hydrogen as well, because it's actually cheaper. It's creating different issues. You need to develop the CCUS. There are people who are going to be saying, oh yeah, but be careful about the methane emissions. And they are completely right. I mean, we need to have a high capture rate. We need to have super low methane emissions. But when I'm looking at a country like Norway, which is like excellent in terms of methane emission, like a platinum medal, I'm kind of hopeful that we can actually move forward in that direction. But you need to be more realistic and pragmatic. And this is why I'm saying again, the fantastic targets that we have had in the strategies, they are not achievable. Be pragmatic, be realistic.
Very much. Actually, I haven't asked the second questions, but both of you answered it by reading the question and answer panel. But for the record, because we are putting this on YouTube, I will read the question out first. So what is your view on the hydrogen target for RFNBO, which refers to the renewable fuels of non-biological origin in the EU? There's a target for 42% by 2030 and then 60% by 2035 for the industry in RED III in Europe. RED refers to the Renewable Energy Directive, right? So we will move on to the next question since both of you have already touched on this. Then there's a question That's quite a simple question. So any one of you can answer it. Let's see who goes first. Is there a global framework or certification scheme for clean hydrogen that is currently being used? Any takers? Anne-Sophie, why don't you go?
Yeah, there are a lot of discussions about global certification. IPHE, for example, the International Partnership for Hydrogen, is working on that. The Hydrogen Council as well is working on that. So there have been, some agreements which have been announced last year at COP in Dubai. I think there is progress on that because people realize that, you need to speak in a common voice. The first very important thing is that we need to have a common methodology in order to calculate the same way everywhere the carbon intensity of hydrogen, because if people are using a different methodology, it's not going to work. And then, we can work on harmonizing the different frameworks, the different regulatory frameworks which exist across the different regions. So, for example, if you are looking at hydrogen in the US, they are giving different ranges in terms of carbon intensity, the highest being 4 kilograms of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. In the EU, basically the kind of line, the threshold is at 3.38 kilogram of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. So we have slightly different benchmarks, but I think they can be harmonized. Where it's also going to be important is whether these things that we are seeing in the EU, which might be replicated in the US, are also going to be promoted or put in place in other countries, which are additionality. So when you want to produce renewable hydrogen, you are adding dedicated renewable capacity, additional capacity. You have the temporal matching, so you need to prove that, for example, every hour or every day or every month, depending on what you choose, the electricity is coming from renewable production, and the production of electricity is in the same zone to be defined, of course, depending on the country you are looking at. It's going to be different in Southeast Asia, in India, in China, in Europe, in the US. They need to be in the same region.
Thank you very much. We have another question that just came in. How much hope should we put on geological hydrogen? By that, I think they refer to white hydrogen or natural hydrogen. That is something that has been in the media spotlight lately. And how do we balance the priorities between hubs and local demand for scaling manufactured low-carbon hydrogen and the prerequisites, such as transportation and storage infrastructure for mining geological hydrogen? So basically, Anne-Sophie, maybe because this is more like a global question as well.
I think for me, natural hydrogen or geological hydrogen should be a no-regret option. So I would encourage all the countries which think that they might have geological hydrogen to look into it. This is what is happening in Australia. This is what is happening in my home country in France, where we may have potential in the eastern part and southern part of the country. US is also interested. Morocco was one of the first countries to put that in their national strategy. Brazil is also looking into that. There have been some studies which are looking at, where natural hydrogen has been recorded, because the thing is that we had never been looking at natural hydrogen before. This was not interesting, but now people are realizing, actually this may be interesting. So no regret, look into it. Look into whether you have potential or not. That's as simple as that.
If I have to add to what Sophie said, from what I have discussed in the industry, low pressure hydrogen is largely discredited because very difficult. It's a very small molecule, and at that low pressure, it's very difficult to capture. So as she mentioned, it's a no regret option. If all else fails, that is something depending on the country they might want to have a look at. But basically speaking, it is better to focus on green hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen, which is producible in large amounts. That is a way better and more realistic option is what I feel.
Okay, thank you very much. So I have a question from Ms. Sharon Sia, my colleague. I will read it out here. Returning to Anne-Sophie's brief point at the end about ASEAN taking a leaf from the EU's integrated infrastructure. If, for example, the development of the ASEAN power grid is able to tap into pumped hydro in a few locations with greater utilization of renewable energy in the grid, would this help the region leapfrog its decarbonization? Do you see potential for the region to leverage different countries' geographies and industry strengths? For example, it would make sense that Singapore's petrochemical hub, aviation and marine shipping hub status will make excellent utilization of low carbon hydro. But the problem is transportation, whereas a location like Sarawak could deploy pumped hydro, tap into hydroelectricity to produce low carbon hydrogen. So I guess it's the distributed or fragmented nature of ASEAN at the moment. Yes.
Yeah, and first I'm going to tackle the pump hydro. Pump hydro is actually a very interesting complement to renewable electricity like solar and wind, because you can achieve a much higher load factor, which is very good in order to reduce the levelized cost of hydrogen. Because the problem with wind and solar is that they are intermittent. So unless you are in a very specific region, you are going to be hampered by maybe not high enough load factor. Actually, last week I was moderating a panel with the chairman of a Greenco company that maybe Mr. Kartik knows, and he mentioned that his project in India is planning to use renewable electricity complemented with pumped hydro, and that therefore they are hoping to reach 90% of load factor. So that will be one thing. Where of course you need to make a lot of progress, and this is honestly everywhere in the world, not only a problem in Southeast Asia, is deployment of the grid. I mean, we have a lot of ambitions, all of us, in terms of the deployment of renewable electricity, but every time, the projects are actually going faster than the grid deployment. And you need to think indeed more regionally. So I don't know exactly what is the state of the regulation in terms of having, cross-border deployment of the grid, but given that we are facing sometimes, some issues there and there, I can imagine that it can be problematic. But this is really the problem. Otherwise, I would say, it would be very good to basically think regionally, because you can use each other's strength.
If I can quickly add to that, one problem with what Sharon has raised in Sarawak, etc., is that if you see, there is not enough power left, because the peak demand in their own grid is going to go up, and they will definitely try and address that first. So that itself will require a few extra gigawatts of power, and they also want to export power to Singapore. So which means that these two things will conflict with the production of green hydrogen. So that is just for starters, with respect to just Sarawak. And ASEAN Power Grid, it has been in the talks for 10 years now. It will be nice, as Sophie mentioned. If we can realize it, it will be great. But the demands of 800 million people, 700, 800 million people, energy needs will come first. So frankly speaking, Sarawak as a solution for the next 10 years is openly speaking out. It's not very, very practical.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, you need to put decarbonization of the grid first. And this is why there is basically a fundamental difference between Europe, where our power demand is going to grow, but at a slower rate. Not in Southeast Asia, where you still have population growth, you're still seeing very strong growth in terms of power demand. So you need to put a priority in the power sector, which may lower the availability for hydrogen production.
Not to mention, pumped hydro is frightfully expensive. Only the guys with the deepest pockets can actually get into it. In India, we have 40 gigawatts of pipeline of pumped hydro. Not even 1 gigawatt is under construction, because even the state-owned hydropower companies with deep pockets, they don't want to touch it. It's very difficult. That is also one other thing which we have to keep in mind.
Why is it difficult?
because your project needs to be very big in size. Typically, your pumped hydro needs to be in the range of few gigawatts for it to actually fully work, and that means a frightful amount of capex. And the moment you start talking hydro, you also need a lot of land. So no private player, unless you are willing to guarantee their profits or IRR to a certain extent, is going to put their hand there. At least in this part of the world, nobody will touch it. The PLNs or the NTPCs or the NHPCs in India are not going to touch it they're trying to do it, but very, very unlikely to it will come up in terms of few tens of gigawatts, which is what you require in terms of deep storage, right? 6 to 8 hours of storage if you're talking to actually balance it out and produce enough power. That is quite a big commitment.
So Karthik, follow-up question, looking at Southeast Asia then. So what are the specific infrastructure challenges that Southeast Asia face in scaling up low carbon hydrogen production and distribution? I mean, you have talked about the hydro power dimension. Are there other possibilities? And if we talk about the full supply chain or having the right infrastructure in place, right? Can you tell us where we are at the moment?
So right now, what I think is that what will work, what might work, is what we are seeing in India. So what basically they are trying to do is that they are trying to build captive power upstream specific to the project and squeeze the cost to the minimum there, and then use that. And because if you have to export, you also need to meet export standards, because the power consumption needs to be matched at every hour for it to meet, for example, the EU standards for green hydrogen. So that is something they can try and do. Start with captive projects which will actually produce the hydrogen, and find an off-taker, say Singapore. In this case, Singapore is already doing it. They are off-taking from India. So like that, you need a initial project which is big enough, where the government say off-takes or comes up with a contract for differential pricing, where they basically guarantee the first investor that they will make their money. So without these things, so upstream power, and then you can import electrolyzers and run them initially. That's no problem. But upstream power is the first and foremost. So we need to have a good example, implement one example per country first, and then hope that it bootstraps. That is probably the only way out, I think.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, I have a question here for Anne. Since it will be a very competitive market in the future, what are the key important factors to boost green hydrogen, because the existing industries are still dominated by grey hydrogen? So I guess the question is, with regards to green hydrogen, is it due to transport, technology, regulation? If you have to, I suppose, rank them, what do you think is the biggest issue?
The biggest issues are the three ones that I mentioned. I mean, we had an increase in terms of the cost of electricity, and I mean, you need to have very low cost of low carbon electricity. I mean, it has to be, ideally in the $20 to $30 per megawatt hour to make sense, and to really reach a very low cost. So, there are not that many places right now where we have that. So that's number one. The cost of financing, and maybe this is something that Karthik can mention. We have been, going through an episode of super high cost of financing, which have been a problem for everyone. I mean, it's not only the energy industry, but it's particularly the energy industry. And now we are seeing that, the Fed has just cut a little bit the Fed has cut the rate, European Central Bank, and I think, we are going to come down a little bit, but we need to go back to, I would say, normal financing rates. Now, there is usually a problem for some developing countries, which is that they do not have access to cheap financing, and that is, I would say, a problem that can only be tackled at COP levels. It's not for all the countries. I would say it's particularly the case for example, some African countries, but this is very important, so access to cheap financing. The third one is the electrolyzers. So we saw that, for India, they are trying to develop their own electrolyzers. I would say that China right now is really in the lead in terms of development of electrolyzers, and theirs are much cheaper. Now it's a question mark. I mean, do you want to import cheaper electrolyzers coming from China? I know that in the US and Europe, they are really trying not to, because they want to protect their own industry, but they also have, trying to develop their own industry at the same time. If in specific Southeast Asian countries, they do not have this ambition to develop their own electrolyzer industry, then maybe buying Chinese is actually a good idea.
We keep talking about renewable energy and its costs, right? What about access to water? Is that a big issue?
Excess water. What do you mean by that?
No, I mean, we need water to produce the green hydrogen.
Oh, yeah. It will be a problem if Egypt or Algeria tries to produce hydrogen. Yes, they are going to need demineralized water, which in turn will also take money. So water, yes, it's going to likely be an issue, but not an immediate issue, at least in parts of ASEAN or India, where the rains are still okay. There are big rivers. You still have. I think in India the demineralized water is available at like 10 rupees a liter or something. It's like less than 10 years. It should not a problem in countries with which are not water stressed, but it will become a problem by 2040, 2045 as more nations start becoming water stressed. Yes, then that is something we have to really consider.
So another question to both of you. Anne-Sophie mentioned about China and also the electrolyzer industry. More broadly speaking, how does geopolitics affect the development of low carbon hydrogen in Southeast Asia and the world? Is there, I mean, we are talking very much about the markets right now, right? And also domestic government policies. And we talk about the need for international
Would Sophie like to go first?
Sorry?
You can go first, Sophie. Anne can go first.
Yes, sure. I mean, the geopolitics of hydrogen are very interesting. I mean, you can look at that from two different points of view. You can look at that from the trade perspective, so trading hydrogen molecules or derivatives, and you can see that we have seen a certain number of memorandum of understanding between potential importers and potential exporters. There was a very good report from IRENA, which was published at the beginning of 2022, where they were highlighting that, and these countries are cooperating. And for example, Germany has, been trying to develop the hydrogen diplomacy, H2 Diplo, as they call it, and having, in some countries, some specific offices which are helping the countries with the view of basically, getting that hydrogen or ammonia back to Germany. There is a danger, however, there of eco-colonialism. I mean, you can't, as a developed country, just go to, let's say, Namibia and say, hey, I am developing renewable electricity and I am taking everything back for myself. I don't think these kind of behaviors are acceptable anymore. The second part of the whole geopolitics of hydrogen is trying to have technology leadership. And this is what we are seeing on different levels, whether this is electrolyzers, whether this is fuel cells, and different parts of the hydrogen value chain. Many regions are trying to advance themselves. They want to be leader. You can see that in many national hydrogen strategies. I don't think everybody will be able to dominate. Electrolyzers also, this is not like one big market. You have the alkaline electrolyzers, you have the PEM, you have the solid oxide, you have the anion exchange membrane. They are all at different stages of research. So it can be very well that, some countries are dominating on some parts and others are in other type of electrolyzers.
To add to that, so I'll give you an example in India what companies are doing. There is one company which is importing electrolyzers from China, alkali, very simple AEC electrolyzers. They import it from China. What do? They dismantle it, and then they, through their own operational processes, they improve the parts, the stack, the rectifier, they improve the working of each part of the electrolyzer. And then they quote the price of the electrolyzer to the downstream company who wants it by component. So when the component parts are, they work on that first. And then captively, they produce power at less than 3 cents a megawatt. And then they squeeze the efficiency out of the electrolyzer to the maximum extent possible. So what happens is that LCOH is already close to $3 or it's fallen. So like that, whether India and basically India and China are basically still locked in conflict on the border. But that has not stopped us from importing electrolyzers, because if you develop your own electrolyzers, there are PEM electrolyzer factories that are coming up in the north of India, frightfully expensive. So because of the minerals and also the processes, it will take time for India to catch up on the curve. So where possible, they are cutting down costs using available technology, but they are also keeping an eye on the long term on technology mastership across the supply. So that is also something they are trying to focus on, because they need to be aware of a lot of things. So that is something I think other nations also need to keep in mind, because if you need to be competitive, you need to have an integrated handle on the entire supply chain. Without that, you are not going to be competitive in this market. That is what I have seen, at least on the ground. Guys who are succeeding are the guys who are actually doing this. Every 10 cents matters. That's how they think.
I see that we have 1 or 2 more questions, but unfortunately time is up. We are at 4:30. I would like to thank the speakers for making time to share their expertise with us. And also thank you to my ISIS colleagues who have been working behind the scenes. And thank you to the audience for tuning in. This seminar will be posted on the ISIS Yusof Ishak YouTube channel, so you can rewatch it there or share it with your friends. And we have come to the end of the seminar. Thank you very much, everybody, and goodbye.